Chapter 14. Back to the Valley. The safe return of the party was a cause of much rejoicing in the king's castle. Jammin told the story of Waver's courageous battle, and that young man was received with open arms and restored to his former responsibilities. As for Robin and Lannis, they were besieged with questions by the young men of the castle, and had to tell many times over their adventures in the Valley of Despair. Lannis found that the chain of outposts guarding the castle had been strengthened during their absence, and that 2 new outposts had been added to the group. Trees had been felled along the path to the valley, making the steep way down the mountainside more open and easier to patrol. But the enemy had been busy, and constant scrimmages occurred around the outpost on the dark mountain slopes. Robin was given charge of one of the newer, smaller outposts, and Lannis saw little of him. Lannis dropped contentedly back into his job of helping Jammin about his business of the castle, but he found himself called out more and more to form a part of rescue parties or in reinforcements for some hard-pressed patrol or outpost. Frequently on these occasions he found himself the leader of small rescue parties with a group of younger soldiers under his command. More than once he found himself face to face with the particular enemy that Jammin called his besetting sin, but each time his good sword and splendid condition gave him the victory. Lannis learned more about his enemy in the encounters. He found that if he struck out boldly, carrying the fight to the evil one, victory was easy, but that when he fought more cautiously, letting the enemy attack first, the evil one grew strong and was only defeated after a long and hard struggle. One morning, several months after their return from the Valley of Despair, Lannis and Jammin were walking back to the castle after their daily sword practice, when Jammin said suddenly, "Lannis, have you thought of returning to the valley?" "Back to my old life?" asked Lannis in amazement. "No, never." "I didn't mean that exactly," returned Jammin with a smile. "I meant, have you thought of bringing others to the castle in the same way that Robin brought you?" Lannis studied the ground thoughtfully. "Yes, I have," he said at last. "I've thought of it, but I haven't done anything about it. Do you think I should go?" Jammin looked at him soberly. The king's last command to his soldiers before he left the valley was to tell others of him. Lannis sighed deeply. "The king must have directed you to speak to me today," he said. "To tell you the truth, Jammin, I've felt for several weeks now that I must go to the valley. The sword has been drawing me. Each time that I pass near the path in the course of my duties, the sword has pulled me towards it, and I have known in my innermost heart that it was the will of the king to send me. But each time I have refused to go. Jammin, perhaps I am foolish, but do you know, I'm more afraid of telling my old friends about the king than I am of meeting the enemy in open combat." "It is difficult for all of us," said Jammin kindly. "Being laughed at is one of the hardest things for any man to face, but that too is our duty as soldiers of the king. Besides, Lannis, when the king leads through the sword, the mission is never in vain. We may see no results, but his will is always best." "I suppose I've been selfish," said Lannis, as they passed through the doorway of the castle. "There are many there in the valley who should know the king. I'll go, Jammin, as soon as I can." So Lannis went back to the valley. It was a beautiful sunny morning when he left the castle and started down the rocky path. He wore a traveling cloak over his armor, and carried some of the king's food in a package by his side. He walked warily, looking from side to side in the woodland shadows for evidence of the enemy, and until he reached the open fields near the foot of the mountains, he carried his sword drawn in his hand. Then, knowing that the enemy was not likely to attack him in open sunlight, he put it back into its sheath. As he walked along, Lannis wondered how he would be received by his old friends, and he wondered too how he would feel when he found himself back in his boyhood haunts. Lannis had not, in all the many months of the castle, felt the least bit homesick for his old life in the valley, but still he wondered. As Lannis walked along the high road toward the village, thinking of these things, he suddenly became aware of a figure on the other side of the road, moving in the same direction as he himself was going. This sudden appearance startled Lannis, who had heard no one come up behind him, and he was even more startled when, looking more closely at this figure, he saw it to be one of the enemy. Lannis whirled, drawing his sword and swinging his shield from his back to battle position on his left arm. But as he did so, the figure, grinning mockingly, drifted like a wraith of smoke up the bank on the side of the road. Lannis, puzzled and troubled, resumed his walk down towards the village, and no sooner had he done so than the figure came down again to the road and walked parallel to him. Again Lannis turned to attack it, and again the leering face of the enemy retreated. But each time that he turned his face in the direction of the village, his enemy moved with him. Then Lannis understood. This evil one was not sent to fight with him, but to follow him on his mission in the valley. Resolutely, with one eye cocked carefully on his enemy, he set out again towards the village. The road toward the village passed the homestead of Farmer Pellin, a man whom Lannis knew only slightly. He was about to pass it by when he felt the gentle pull of the sword. "The king wants me to turn in here," he said to himself. "I wonder why." Obediently, he left the high road and started up the path towards the house. Halfway there, he found his friend Erdal leaning against the fence. Erdal was a young man with whom Lannis had grown up, and he was as amazed to see Lannis as Lannis had been to see Robin a year or so before. In answer to his questions, Lannis told him of the great change that had come into his life. "Do you mean, Lannis," Erdal asked, "that you have given your life to the cause of fighting against evil?" "I am a follower of the king," said Lannis, "who is the enemy of all that is evil." "That is wonderful," said Erdal with real feeling. "I really believe, Lannis, that you have made a good and wise choice, and I admire you for it. I am not learned in the teachings of your king, and I know some speak evil of him and of his followers, but I believe that his way will triumph in the end." "I'm glad you think as I do," said Lannis, greatly encouraged. "Will you come with me and see for yourself what our castle and fellowship are like?" Erdal turned his eyes away and looked out across the fields of ripening grain. I would like to," he said slowly, "but I can't. You see, Farmer Pellin has promised me a part interest in his crop if I help him cultivate and harvest it this year. With the money I receive, I plan to buy an acre or two of my own." He looked at Lannis earnestly. "This opportunity means much to me, Lannis, and I can't afford to let anything spoil it. I cannot even spend a day away from my work, or I might be the loser." "But you don't see," urged Lannis. "This is even more important. No farms, nor lands, nor crops should prevent you from finding truth." But Erdal only shook his head. Then Lannis saw, leaning against the fence only a short distance away, the dark figure of the enemy smiling in ugly triumph at him. Quickly Lannis drew his sword and pointed at the evil one. "Look, Erdal, quickly! Do you not see at the edge of the field that evil thing, the curse of this valley? See how the power of the sword makes it visible? That is a part of the evil which rules over your land and your crops and, yes, your life. Will you not break away now and come with me to freedom?" But Erdal said, "I see nothing but the sun shining on the field of wheat, ripening them for harvest." So Lannis sadly bade him goodbye and went towards the village, with the evil one drifting silently along the other side of the road. Next, the sword led him to a large house at the edge of the village, where lived Zemla, a longtime friend of Lannis's father, and a man who had always been kind to Lannis. Zemla, a thin, pleasant-faced man, sat writing at the desk piled with papers, but he laid down his pen with an eager smile when Lannis was announced. "Lannis, my boy, do come in," he said. "I've been thinking of you much lately and wondering where you were. It has been more than a year since you last stopped in to talk to me. Where have you been, and what have you been doing?" Lannis told him of his adventures and how he had become a servant and soldier of the king. Zemla listened quietly, his face expressionless. When Lannis had finished, he said, "Ah, my boy, but you left the valley at the wrong time. When you left, we were having a bad year. The crops were poor, the people discontented, and we were on the verge of war with two of the other villages of the valley. Now we've changed all that. The village has developed a new fertilizer, which will improve the output of the farms. We've changed our mayor and the village council, and things are going much better. And the threat of war is just about over. I'm serving right now as part of a commission which is drafting a peace treaty with the other villages. If we design this treaty properly, we need never have another war." Lannis remembered the words of the king's book in the castle library. They shall cry, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. But he thought it best not to argue that point. So he said, I left the valley not for those things you mentioned, but because I wanted to be free of sin and to find truth and righteousness. This I found in the service of the king. Zemla, the king's service is the only way to true happiness." But Zemla said, shaking his head, "Lannis, I'm older than you and wiser. The way you follow has attracted many in the past, but we are more enlightened now, and we solve our problems right here in the valley instead of trying to escape from them. Listen, Lannis, I had a friend when I was your age who thought as you do. He was a brilliant lad, and might have been a wise and useful man, but he chose to throw his life away following that foolish idea of your king and chasing phantoms on the mountainsides. His name was Jamin." "I know him," said Lannis simply. "Don't be like him, Lannis. Stop before it's too late. Believe me, this myth of an evil power which hangs over the valley is all nonsense. There is no evil which we can't do away with ourselves, and when peace is finally brought to the entire valley, you will find that these fairy tales of evil beings will disappear." Lannis looked past Zemla through the open window and saw, under the tree in the front yard, the mocking figure of his enemy, who stood listening to the conversation. And he thought sadly of the wise men of the world, like Zemla, who for all their wisdom cannot see the figure of evil for what it is, and who try to fight it with laws and treaties, not with the king's sword. Lannis sighed and rose to his feet. "I will never return to my old life, Zemla," he said. "I believe that Jamin made the wise choice and you the unwise one, and I earnestly invite you to visit our castle and judge for yourself." Zemla smiled. "I should like to come sometime, Lannis, if only to humor you and see Jamin again. But I'm too busy now working for peace. However, come and see me again on your next trip to the valley." Lannis left the house and walked on through the village, sad and disheartened. He was failing in his mission. When he again looked up, he found himself in front of the home of Farmer Broadleaf, where there had always in time past been a welcome for him. For several moments he stood there before he realized that the sword was gently pulling him towards the entrance. The good farmer and his wife were overjoyed to see him again, as were the Broadleaf children. But when Lannis asked how his friends had been getting along since he last saw them, the farmer shook his head. "Rather poorly, Lannis," he said. "My crop last year failed, leaving me in debt. This year's crops are better and would enable me to pay my debt, but I have not enough money to hire the help to help harvest it. If only I had one more to work with me." Lannis hesitated. There was nothing he wanted so much as to leave the valley again and return to the castle, but he could not leave his friend in trouble. "I will stay and help you for a few weeks," he said.